Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of You, Me, and Ennui. I'm your host, Mary Kate Polanin, and I'm here joined by our next guest. And before I tell you a little bit more about her, I'm going to introduce you to the topic of today's episode. So, today we're going to be talking about work, which we're talking about this entire season. So, we're drilling down a little bit to the idea of our attitude towards work. Do we shoot for the stars and get the job of our dreams, or is it a little more practical or maybe pragmatic to decide to say that a job is just a job and that's just fine? So we're going to be diving into questions like these with our guest, Alyse Maguire. Alyse is a freelance writer and editor. She covers a variety of topics from health to tech, but has spent the majority of her career covering workplace trends and managing freelance networks for publications, including the Muse and Business Insider. You can follow her work via her website or on X, and we'll leave information on her website and her handle in the show notes. Welcome, Alyse.
Thank you for having me.
So good to have you. You've written so much about the nature of work and work relationships that we're really excited to have you on the show today to answer some of our really burning questions about, the nature of work, hybrid work, how to go for the job that's right for you. So if it's all right with you, we'll just dive right in.
Yeah, let's do it.
Great. All right, so we'll start with this. You previously worked for the Muse, where you wrote almost 500 articles about work and professional life. What were your career biggest takeaways from writing and editing so many career-related articles?
Yeah. So I guess there's a few. I feel like the biggest theme of a lot of the questions we were getting and the kinds of hurdles that job seekers are trying to get through was, how do I get a job that I'm excited about, that I've been wanting for so long? So whether you've been job searching for months and you just haven't gotten there, or you're trying to make a career change, or you're right out of school, figuring out your first entry level job. So obviously the advice is tailored to those specific situations, but sort of the common themes that arose, the first being networking. I feel like it really is the way in. It's how I've gotten a lot of my jobs and also
Mm.
freelance jobs when I went full-time freelance. It's how a lot of my friends have gotten jobs. It's, just in general, the best way to get your foot in the door when there's so many other people gunning for the same jobs. Um, and obviously that's easier said than done, right? Like when you're trying to network, and you just don't have connections in the right places, or you've never done it before or been in a situation where you need to network, it can be really intimidating and you're not really sure how to do it authentically. So we've given a lot of advice, and I've written about this a lot, of how to build those relationships and use your network to your advantage. So that's a big one. And people might be disheartened to hear that, but it really is about who you know, in the field, which isn't always fair, for certain people. I think the other thing is you really are, the manager of your own career. I think, again, it's so much easier to just have somebody give you a job or give you exactly what you need, but you really are in control, and it's the actions that you take and the relationships that you build that ultimately get you where you need to go. And that also goes for when you're in a job, right? So if you have a difficult manager, or you're just not getting promoted or recognized, obviously we all want to and deserve to work for somebody who appreciates us and promotes us and, helps us grow as individuals. But at the same time, we also need to learn how to manage up in those situations, because we're not always going to end up in the ideal work environment. And so taking control over your career, and knowing when to speak up and speak out and take action. And even if taking action is leaving that job for another job, we wanted, especially at the Muse, we wanted to empower people to take control and, to have that autonomy, over where their career goes.
Great. I mean, it sounds like the two themes that you've hit on, management and also networking, are unfortunately just one of those really murky, nebulous. You kind of have to figure it out as you go. Unfortunately, there's no perfect blueprint to follow, right? That's
Right.
that's what I'm hearing, and I've definitely experienced as well. So all the more reason for you to be writing and giving advice to people, because I'm sure there are lots of questions. So I guess I'm curious. Many people look at their careers as something that defines them and who they are as a person. Do you find that that's true for you, or has your view of work changed over time?
Yeah, I think if you'd asked me that question, 5, 8 years ago, I might have said, yeah, I definitely feel defined. I'm a writer, I'm an editor. That's how I identify. I'm approaching 30, and I think I'm seeing my career in a different light now. And I'm sure, as you get older, you might look at your career differently just in general. And that's obviously specific to me, but I don't think it's the defining factor in my life. I think it's one of the many things that I do. If I'm going to like talk about who I am and what I'm passionate about, I am passionate about writing and content, but I'm also passionate about so many other things. My relationships, my partner, my hobbies, travel, things like that. So yeah, but at the same time, I think it's also, there's nothing wrong with being defined by your career. I have so many people in my life who love what they do, and they work really hard at it, and if it defines them and makes them happy, then I'm all power to them. I'm just so happy that they've found something that speaks to them. And so I think it's to each their own. If you don't feel defined by your career, that's great. And if you do feel defined by your career, then that's also great. You can't really go wrong in either situation. It's totally dependent on who you are.
Yeah, I mean, listening to your answer, it sounds like, and maybe this is just one way that it manifests itself, but sometimes it just comes down to the amount of time that you allocate for things like your job. You mentioned relationships, and then maybe someone who really defines themselves by their job. That is how they spend all of their time. If say you were in that situation, or say someone was in that situation, wanted to write to you and ask you a question, they're finding that they're spending all their time on their job, and they're ready to take a step back to not have their job title or career path define them. What advice would you give them in that instance?
It's so hard because I do feel like it's so subjective. And what are the things that help you decompress? What are the things that get you excited to wake up to do in the morning? And obviously for some people that's work, and sometimes it's not.
Mhm.
I think the first thing is to remind yourself that it is just a job. At the end of the day, you're getting paid to do something. If you really enjoyed it, you wouldn't need the money. And if the world was a better place, we could do what we loved and not have to worry about money. So I think kind of taking a step back and remembering that it is a job, and it's just one of the things that you do day to day. I think also reminding yourself of the things that do really motivate you. And again, if it is your work, then that's great. But if you are excited about spending time with friends, or getting to travel, or getting to go to a yoga class at 9 in the morning, setting aside the time to do those things is super important, and setting those boundaries. And work-life balance is so hard, and there's so many people who used to write in about how to build work-life balance, and as much advice as we could give, people would be like, well, that's easier said than done. Like, well, what if I have a million emails to respond to? How do I set that boundary? And again, it's so hard, and it is sort of like a work in progress for people. But um like making the time, and setting the time to create boundaries where you go to work, you do your job, you clock in your hours, you achieve what you need to achieve and is expected of you. And then being like, okay, I've done everything I can today. Like, it's time that I don't check my email, it's time that I log out of Slack. It's time that I focused on having dinner with my family, or picking up my kids from school, things like that. So yeah, I think you have to, again, like I said, you're the biggest control of your career. Like, your boss is gonna, they're gonna send you emails at all hours of the night. They're gonna push your boundaries, and so you have to set them back in place. And if you really are in a career or a job that doesn't allow you to do that, really having that hard conversation with yourself and saying, okay, is this really what I want? Am I going to be able to set boundaries in this job? And if I can't, and I haven't been able to up until this point, like, is it time that I consider a different career? Whether it's leave your job, or take a sabbatical, take a vacation, um, go back to school, lots of options. It can be a really tough decision, but you have to have those hard conversations with yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I love what you're touching on with setting and maintaining boundaries, because I think there is this understanding that creating work-life balance is about, like, just about making time for mindfulness or making time for things, but really you have to look at the other side of the coin and say, okay, but what is demanding more of my time that I can't give? And how do I really not just set that boundary? Because the first time you set it, it's not going to magically wave a wand and have the problem go away. Like you said, you have to consistently maintain it. And I think what you've hit on is really smart. If that can't be respected, that kind of helps you have that hard conversation, but also maybe like point you in the right direction of where you should be. And it's interesting that you bring that up. My next question, because there's like the flip side of that, right? Where you have 1,000 emails that like you don't have the time to answer, and so you find a solution. But some people really wear stress or professional busyness as like a badge of honor. I know I've been in some corporate settings where the joke is that if work's going really well, then probably some of like your friendships are on the back burner or things like we try to joke around like it's PR, not the ER, but at the end of the day, people do take it very seriously, which is great if you're like you said, if your heart's on fire. But
Yeah.
sometimes there's a tendency for that to tip a little bit too far. But why do you think that's so common? Or if you've seen it, why do you think that is?
I think our culture has just sort of shaped this narrative that when you're busy and you work long hours and you have your work phone and your, personal phone at the dinner table, like
Mm.
that's impressive and,
Yeah.
applauded. And I do kind of blame the system that we function under. Like, I think a lot of creating boundaries and better work-life balance for people starts with changing the system. But
Mhm.
that's not something we can control. That's sort of a bigger thing that needs to happen. But yeah, I do really blame the cultural narrative that we've been pushing in media, in television, in sort of the patriarchal society that we might serve under.
Andy and Devil Wears Prada. So yeah.
Yeah. I think we've attributed stress and always being on with being a good worker, which is
Mhm.
just not the right way to be approaching things. A lot of companies are making this really smart pivot where they're saying, we don't care how many hours our employees are working or if they're responding to emails at all hours of the night. We just care about output. And if they're meeting deadlines and, contributing exactly what we're asking of them, we don't care when or where or how they're working. And I think that's, again, how we change the system is, looking at it less like, let's make people stressed and, anxious all the time. And instead, let's give them the best settings so that they can be productive and effective and
Mhm.
efficient, so that they can have a life outside of work so that we can function as a society that's not just focused on work.
That's great that there are companies who are taking a view like that. So that's really encouraging to hear. And
Yeah.
maybe you're right, it is like the media narrative of how the corporate world works. But good to hear that there are some shifts going on. Speaking of shifts, do you think that there's been a generational shift, or maybe it's a pre and post pandemic mindset in how people view their jobs?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely research on this, but also I think just anecdotally, people have reprioritized their lives a little bit more. And I think part of it was just like the physical constraints of COVID. When you're locked in your house for months on end, you realize maybe work isn't the most important thing in the world,
Mhm.
especially if you're a working parent and you're suddenly like, I have to take care of my child every day. They can't go to school the way normally did. Like, maybe I should be spending more time with my family, or maybe this is not the kind of life I want to be leading. Um, and so, yeah, I think it really did shift people's priorities for the better. Um, we're obviously reverting back to our life before the pandemic. So, like I said, I think the system hasn't completely changed, and it should, but we're making progress toward that. I think in terms of generation, I do think there is anecdotal conversations around Gen Z just knowing how to unplug better than um, millennials or baby boomers. Like they have a
Oh,
different approach to
interesting.
work. Yeah. And so there's a lot of conversations about like lazy girl jobs and things like that. And I think it's true. I do think Gen Z has a really nice handle on work in a way that older generations don't. But I also think just in general, when you're younger, as somebody who's was 22 and is no longer 22, I think there's nothing wrong with in wanting to invest in your career early in life. So I think while Gen Z is maybe building better boundaries, I think they're just as invested in their careers as any other generation was. And so you're seeing they're heavily invested in growing and doing stuff that they love, but they also know that they need to be setting boundaries here and there. And so I just love
That's
to be
so
trans.
interesting. I wanted to touch on, you said the term lazy girl job. Can you explain for the listeners at home, if anyone's not familiar, what is a lazy girl job? I was going to say, and how do I get one? But my boss is on this podcast, so I can't.
I mean, it's the dream, right? So from what I can recall, I'm obviously not heavily on TikTok the way some people are, but it was this viral trend where people were just talking about essentially doing the bare minimum in their jobs. So doing enough to get a paycheck or to log enough hours that they won't get fired. There was a lot of backlash where people were saying, oh my God, like, why are workers just being lazy? Why are we using this term? Should we be keeping these people around if they're not going to do the bare minimum, if they're only going to do the bare minimum?
Hmm.
And the flip side was a lot of people who were proponents of this new trend were like, well, companies aren't paying employees enough to work hard. They're asking for way too much. There was this constant, like you said, emphasis on being stressed and busy is a good thing. And employees are realizing, wait, let me reclaim my time. And if I can be productive, but ultimately not go above and beyond, is there really anything wrong with that? If I'm being paid to do a job and I'm doing the job well, I'm not maybe overachieving, but I'm doing it as well as I can. Isn't that enough? And again, just setting boundaries. And so it was this trend that was kind of encouraging people to put their foot down a little bit and reprioritize, what was important to them.
So interesting. And maybe I'm coming from a more biased perspective since I'm technically working in the nonprofit space. This idea of like a dispassionate approach to my 9 to 5 just doesn't really square with my heart for like the mission of what my company is doing and what I'm trying to, do with them. So, do you think that there are some, like what are the benefits and what are the minuses of having less of an emphasis on being passionate or being personally fulfilled by your work? Because ultimately, I mean, you spend so much time doing your job. You should find some part of it enjoyable, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone should. If you can't find a job that, sort of excites you every day, there should be a
Mm.
job that at least challenges you and surrounds you with people that you enjoy working with in an environment where you feel respected and safe and ultimately happy. And so, again, while the day-to-day work might not excite you, I think those other factors are just as important. So I think the benefit, obviously, of not finding fulfillment in your job, but finding fulfillment in other things is there's room to find fulfillment in other things. And so you're not suddenly tied to this thing that could go away at any moment. I think at the end of the day, like
Mhm.
a job is just a job, and you could be laid off, the company could shutter, they could
Right.
restructure a team, the job that you signed up for could no longer be the job you signed up for. You could have an amazing boss who leaves and gets replaced by a less than exciting boss. And so when you don't tie your passions to your job, you're not dependent on somebody else for your happiness and fulfillment. You can find it in other places. Obviously, the downside is, like you said, you spend so much time at your job. So I don't think it's a matter of making your job your passion, but it is about finding moments where you are passionate about the work that you do. It's going to feel like work, but it shouldn't feel like work every day. And again, the people that you do the work with is ultimately just as important as the work itself.
So true. So, my next question, we're both talking to each other from our home offices right now. So just to be fully transparent with the listeners at home, but with the rise of hybrid and remote work, have you seen a shift in how people view their office as a community? We were just talking about, the people that you work with being a really important and key part of overall fulfillment at work.
Definitely. Yeah, it's so dependent on the population. There are a lot of maybe introverts or, people who really value their life outside of work who have found so much more enjoyment working from home, where they aren't forced to participate in sort of the corporate bonding and social
Pizza
activities.
Fridays. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Which again, some people enjoy, and that's sort of the flip side of it. But there are a lot of people that are finding more fulfillment in their jobs because they can just do their job on their own time, at their own schedule, in a place that they feel comfortable in. And again, talking about like working parents or caretakers, they now have the flexibility to do things outside of work that they otherwise couldn't do if they were required to go to an office. The flip side of that is there are a lot of people, a lot of young people, especially, who really miss the office environment
Yeah.
post COVID. And so they are going back to the office in droves. And so what's great about that is the companies that are encouraging people to go to the office, but not forcing them to, are finding that the people who do come to the office are really recreating those really important social bonds that ultimately contribute to a successful workforce. And so they're coming to the office, they're having in-person meetings, they are going to happy hour, and again, sort of maintaining those relationships with their coworkers, that allow them to be more productive, more happy, just, generally more satisfied in their work. So I think hybrid and remote work has been really good for the workforce, but you also have to find what fits for you. And if you work for a company that's requiring people to come to the office 5 days a week, and that's just not conducive for you, you might be dissatisfied in the work that you're doing. Vice versa, if you work at fully remote, but you are craving that social interaction, maybe you need to be finding ways to go into an office or to at least go to a co-working space where you can interact with people. So again, taking control of your career, and if you
Mhm.
don't have the stuff in front of you, finding a way to put it in front of you, yourself.
Yeah, I was going to say, just speaking specifically to the experience of like a fully remote worker or maybe a recent college grad who doesn't have a job yet, but is on the job hunt. And they're really craving that community. You mentioned a co-working space. Are there other, you know, tips or pieces of advice that you would give to someone who is really looking to build a community, even though they don't really have one yet?
It's so hard. I mean, I think especially if you're coming from college, you're surrounded by people your age for 4, maybe more years, and suddenly you're thrown into the working world, and your friends kind of start sporadically, going in different directions and locations and working in different careers. And so, yeah, you don't have that community around you. Yeah, I mean, I think there's conferences, there's networking groups, there's meetups. I think there's places like Bumble where like you can meet friends, not just use it for online dating, but you can also like date friends and meet new people that way. But yeah, really, when you're job searching, vetting the company as much as they're vetting you. When I was looking for jobs right out of college, it was really important to me to be excited about the people that I would be working with. And so, I advise any recent grad or college student to, when they're interviewing for the company, don't just ask about the job, but ask about the office culture. Go into the office if you can, get FaceTime with as many people as you can, and follow your gut in terms of who are the people that you're really excited about and connect with, and think you can build a community around. That's going to be super important. And yeah, once you land that first job, that's the community you have for life. You keep those connections often forever. And so, there is a lot of value in choosing the right community from the start, to get your career launched.
Yeah, I mean, I love that answer. This follow-up might be a little too specific, but are there, instead of going negative, but looking at the positive, what are some green flags maybe you can look for when you're like, I love what you said, you're vetting the job as or the company as much as they're vetting you. What are some things to look out for when you're trying to decide if this job is right for you?
Yeah. Ooh, that's a good question. I think, the first is just getting a feel for the culture. So, like I said, like when you go to the office and interview, when you walk in the door, are people socializing and, laughing? Are they, sitting in cubicles, not looking at each other, on their computers? And again, each environment's different. If you're somebody who loves to do heads down work and you don't want to be constantly distracted by an open office, like if you walk into an office with cubicles, you might be so excited about that.
Right.
So again, getting a feel of like, can you see yourself working in this office and working alongside these people? And does that vibe, resonate with you? Um, I think again, in terms of green flags, it is really subjective. You kind of have to ask the questions, um, that are going to get to the heart of what you're looking for. So if culture is really important to you, asking people you're interviewing with, whether it's your manager or people around you, tell them, have them describe, some fun activities they do outside the office. Ask them about, how they would define the culture, what are the favorite things they love most about the job, what's made them stay at the company as long as they have,
Mm.
what's, one project they were really enjoyed working on and why, how would they describe the management or leadership culture. So yeah, again, sort of asking those probing questions of each individual. And sometimes I like to ask the same question of multiple people to see if like the answers are consistent. I think that's also a red flag if like everyone's kind of dodging the question, or everyone gives a different answer, or there's something hidden under the answer. You might not be getting as much transparency into how the company really functions as you would like. So something to look out for.
Those are all really helpful. And it's always good to have a follow-up question when you're in an interview. So be sure to take note, listeners at home. All right, well then we're going to pivot to our question that we ask all of our guests, since the name of the podcast is You, Me, and Ennui. Is there anything that is giving you a sense of ennui, listlessness, uncertainty at the moment?
I love this question. I mean, like I said, I'm approaching 30, and I feel like that's a really pivotal. I mean, culturally, it's a very pivotal moment, but I do feel like you've reached the stage of your career in your life where you're like, have I done everything I wanted to do? Do I have any regrets? So I've been trying to like approach that sort of milestone with compassion and giving myself
Hmm.
a break of, what, like you might not have everything figured out now, but you know, be confident that other people around you are also going through the same thing. So I think that's, part of it. I think another thing I'm thinking about is I'm a freelancer full time right now, and freelancing has so much flexibility and opportunity, again, to take ownership of your career. But there's also so many opportunities. And so, one day you might be really enjoying the work you're doing. The next year, wondering, should I be doing something else? Or is this really what I want to be doing long term? And so I am kind of constantly thinking about, what else I could be doing in my career, or what new clients I could be working with that I may not be working with yet. And so I think that's constantly giving me a little bit of ennui in my day-to-day life. But just grateful for the life that I have. And again, reaching this milestone is really great.
Well, as you're searching for those answers, you can go back and re-listen to this podcast and listen to your advice, and maybe listen to the rest of the season.
I really
Um,
should.
but I love your takeaway of giving yourself grace as you approach a major milestone, instead of treating it like this, end all be all, and oh no, like what have I done, sort of dramatic moment. So that really resonated with me. So thank you so much for your time and for answering our questions. Are you working? I mean, you're freelancing. So are you working on anything now that you would love to point our listeners to? Or maybe you can just tease an upcoming project or anything that you have going on. Feel free.
I mean, I would love to connect with any other writers, editors, freelancers, clients with content needs. Feel free to reach out. I love to just meet new people. Like I said, the people you work with define your career. But yeah, nothing big. Definitely feel free to follow me on Twitter or check out my website.
Love it. Your first answer was about networking and your last answer was about networking. So you're very consistent.
You got to practice what you preach.
There you go. Great. Well, Alyse, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a pleasure. Like I said, we're going to leave all the information where you can find Alyse's work or how to connect with her in the show notes. So be sure to check those out.
Thank you so much for having me.